All right, welcome back, grade 10s. Yesterday we began our look at human rights, which is the last major topic of the year. And it's a topic that, as I mentioned yesterday, will return in grade 11 when you look at some of the causes of the French Revolution, which focus around the lack of human rights in the old regime under absolutism. Therefore, the need for the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen of 1789 by the French revolutionaries. But we'll also see human rights come back again when you study history in Social 20. And you see some of the human rights violations during World War I and World War II under the regimes of people like Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany and under Joseph Stalin in the inter-year wars as well. And human rights will come back in Social 30s. So again, don't throw these notes away. Yesterday, we, in an introductory way, we defined human rights, and we began a list of what human rights are. We mentioned that human rights in Canada are protected under our Constitution, and more specifically the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And in the United States, they are listed under the Bill of Rights. And I planted a seed, and that seed was that today I'd be asking you to do an assignment for me in a bit. And that assignment is going to be looking at the human rights that we've listed. And I want you to come up with some hypothetical scenarios when the state may feel it's justified in order to reasonably limit those rights, to borrow the language from the Charter itself. So we're going to go back a little bit to the Prezi that I created and look at the content of the Canadian Charter, and I'll make some connections to the US Bill of Rights as well. But within, I'm going to guess, 20 minutes or less, we'll be giving you some time to work on a assignment, and it's just simply going to be taking the rights that we're talking about now and coming up with reasonable limits. Again, the purpose of social studies is to see nuances, to see multiplicity, to see plurality, and to see those gray areas in this, to what extent, question, this battle between freedom and control. You know, under what circumstances is it justifiable for the state to usurp our freedom? And that's a major theme in 30 that we're just kind of getting started with this year and now. So, diving into the Prezi. So please keep in mind that these links are in the online lessons. So by all means, when you're reviewing or when you need to, go back and revisit at any time, these links will be there for you. That's not me trying to get more people to visit my Prezi because I stopped loving these Prezis years ago. That's just me trying to make sure that you have access to the resources you need. So that's the concept we're wrestling with here, is the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits. So we have to explore, well, what is reasonable then? Prescribed by law, so these can only be reasonable limits that are still within the legal system. And Trudeau cannot come up with reasonable limits that he thinks are reasonable as he's having his breakfast. These are ones that must be prescribed by law. And it needs to be justified. It needs to be demonstrated, demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So they can only they can only reasonably limit our rights as long as Canada remains a democratic society, as long as Canada remains a free society. So those are important criteria right there in the preamble, that we can't change the nature of Canada. It's not reasonable to limit our rights to create a non-democratic society, a authoritarian society, a dictatorship, a tyranny. It's not reasonable to limit things that you can't justify. So there is still, in this word justified, there's still a key nuance of a democracy, and that's accountability. That the executive branch, along with the legislative branch, which is Parliament in Canada, you studied that last year in 9, that Parliament cannot limit your rights unless they can justify it. So the idea that they have to justify it means they have to answer to it. They will be held accountable. So if they're being held accountable, and if they have to demonstrate it, there's still transparency and accountability. This word means there's still transparency in government. This means that there's still accountability in government, And here it still means that the foundation of Canada is the will of the people. So a big key skill that we need is to look at language and to unpack the meaning of it. And even in this assignment, we can see that we can only reasonably limit, so it has to be reasonable, meaning that it has to be logical, that people have to agree that it's necessary, that there's accountability, transparency, and the will of the people and the rule of law are still all being adhered to. So, with those criteria, we have a list that we're going to be looking at. So for each of the following, hypothesize when freedoms are reasonably limited. And in your notes, I want you to take note of these freedoms. Freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. When is it okay for us to say to someone, yeah, Canada is a nation where people have freedom of religion, but I want you to think critically, think hypothetically. You can use contemporary and historical evidence that has happened, but I want you to also think hypothetically about when in Canada can they reasonably limit our fundamental freedoms. And our fundamental freedoms is a big umbrella in Canada. It includes religion, it includes thought and belief and expression, it includes assembly and association. In Canada, we call them fundamental freedoms. In the United States, much of that is under the umbrella of the First Amendment. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at when is it reasonable to limit our fundamental freedoms? So things like religion. When would it be reasonable to say, Canada's a nation of tolerance and plurality, but we cannot tolerate this, or we cannot tolerate that. So for example, just to get things started, there was a group in the United States in the San Francisco Bay Area called Heaven's Gate. And some call them a religion. Others may look at them and say, no, I see a cult. So Heaven's Gate, religion or cult, depending upon your perspective, was a group of people that saw a comet that was visiting the planet Earth in the 1990s as more than just a comet. This was our mothership returning to collect us. But in order to be, beamed up, there are certain things we needed to do. And one of them, for the men in the group, was castration. They had to castrate themselves. And then everyone in the group had to commit ritual suicide. That's how they get beamed up. So the United States also has freedom of religion. But people might look at the Heaven's Gate group and say, this is not a religion, this is a cult. This is dangerous. And at times, the government must reasonably limit your freedoms. Much like a parent may act in your best interest when you seem unable to make a decision for yourself. That's the whole point of parenting. And the government is ultimately our federal or our national parent. And sometimes if we're acting irrationally, irresponsibly, castrating ourselves, killing ourselves, not only killing ourselves, but killing your children because they're part of the collective that you've introduced to the group, then the government might say, you know what, we're going to intervene here and we're going to say no. This practice, this group cannot exist. Heaven's Gate is only one example. There are many coming out of the United States, but many also coming out of Canada. And I want you to think about that critically. And there's no right or wrong answer here. I'm not going to judge you based upon which group you put down and say, oh man, you're being intolerant. You're being, racist or biased against them. No, the whole point is I want you to think critically. I'm not going to mark your outcome, I'm going to mark your process. So you don't have to please me with which groups you pick, or whether you pick groups. I'm looking for you to be thinking critically. That's the outcome here. Not that in the end you pick like, oh man, Heaven's Gate cult. That was a horrible cult. It shouldn't exist. No, it's not the group. It's the process that's important. Freedom of belief. Is there a belief that you wish, that belief should be illegal? That opinion should be illegal. Maybe there's none that should be reasonably limited. Maybe your idea is like Voltaire, that I may not agree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. So maybe when it comes to the freedom of speech, you're an absolutist. You're like, there's no limits to freedom of speech. So there's no such thing as hate speech in your mind. There's no such thing as a need for censorship in your mind. That in any audience, any words are appropriate in your mind. Or maybe you look at freedom of speech and you say, well, there are times to reasonably limit it. Mr. McBride's in front of a class of, not adults, but near adults, and there's things that my union and my government limit me from saying. Maybe there's things I shouldn't say because of the point of your academic journey that you're on. Is it appropriate for people in certain positions to be reasonably limited by what they can and cannot say? There's concerts that are only viable for people over the age of 18. You have to be 18 to go to the concert because of the way they express themselves at the concert, because of the music or the performance attached to the music. There's some very explicit artists that are not street artists because what they do cannot be done on the street. I mean, it is done on the street, but probably illegally, right? So, freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom of the press. Is there a time, critically thinking, is there a time when the press should be silenced and say, yeah, you know what, you can't air that story? Because, again, think critically. You can't air that story because you're printing pictures and they're very graphic. And the families of the people involved have not been notified yet about what has happened. And we don't want them to find out through the newspaper. That'd be a horrible way to find out about the consequences of this accident. Or even if they have found out, what's the point of showing those graphic pictures? Maybe we can show less graphic pictures. We get there was an accident, there's a terrorist attack. We don't need to focus on the gore. So can the freedom of can the press be restricted? If the press hears about Operation Overlord in June of 1944, before it happens, is the press under some kind of government reasonable limit that they're not allowed to talk about it? Because if they mentioned it in the Chicago Times, then maybe the Nazis are waiting for us on the beaches of Normandy. Peaceful assembly. So is there a time when governments can say to us, yeah, you know what, we get it, people can peacefully assemble, and you're still peaceful, but we have a problem with the assembly. So it does say peaceful assembly. So a reasonable limit would be if it's not peaceful, but that's right there in the name. So is there a time when the government can say to people, you know what, no, not here, not now, you can't assemble here and now. This time is inappropriate. At the funeral of Tim McLean in Winnipeg, after he was beheaded and partially cannibalized on a Greyhound bus heading from Edmonton to Winnipeg, at his funeral, Tim McLean's funeral in Winnipeg, across the street, there is an assembly of a church from Texas that was using the funeral as an opportunity, because the press was there, to get the nation and the world's attention, because they're from the United States, about issues that they shared. And they did it in a way that the government in Winnipeg said, no, you don't have the right to assemble here now. That your protest needs to go away. There's a funeral across the street, and the way you are doing this, although it appears peaceful, is creating a lot of issues, right? So it's reasonable. Are there some associations that we should be able to say, you know what, that association shouldn't exist? We get it, you have the right to an association, but what's the purpose of your association? We don't like your association. There's legal associations in Canada, legal, like the Hells Angels, legal that are controversial. Many people support the Hells Angels. Many do not. Some of the nicest people I know are Hells Angels, but not everybody likes the Hells Angels. So freedom of association. Do groups have the right to exist? So when does a group, when does an association become illegal? So many ways that you can think about that. Is it reasonable for us to limit, gangs in high schools? I'm sure Mr. Denny believes it is. I'm sure our parent council believes it is. But people within a gang probably see a need for that gang. But people outside the gang probably feel that the gang shouldn't exist. So when is that association, when is that gang considered reasonably limited? So it's easy to read something off of a page. It's easy to memorize something. A higher mental activity is to think critically and hypothesize. You need to read and react, read and respond. I want you to look at a list and say, oh, wait a minute. These things should not be absolute. There's got to be a time when we can reasonably limit these things. You have a few more to consider. Some easy ones. Democratic rights. Are there people within Canada that shouldn't get to vote? We have the right to vote. We have the right to run for office. Are there some Canadians that you would say, yeah, you know what, they don't get to vote? Maybe they've committed fraud in elections in the past. You've cheated at voting in the past. You don't get the right to vote now. Quid pro quo. Quid pro quo. Here's the logical actions. We can trace it back. So democratic rights. When do you take away the right to vote or the right to run in an election? What about mobility rights? Do we have the right to reasonably limit a group of Canadians and say, most Canadians can come and go as they wish, but not you, not now, because you have COVID-19 and you're under quarantine? That's a reasonable limit of mobility rights. We don't want people currently infected with COVID-19 freely walking among the general population. If we do want that, then we are basically saying we want all Canadians to become infected. So, are there times when mobility rights can be taken away? Can they be reasonably limited? A quarantine is an obvious one. We limit mobility rights all the time. If you've ever been in jail, you can't just say, you know what, I'd like to go to Wendy's right now. I'm hankering for a Frosty. I'll be back. I got this. No, you're in jail. Your mobility rights have been taken away. If you're in prison, your mobility rights have been taken away longer term, right? So if you're in lockup, your mobility rights are taken away. If there's a curfew, your mobility rights are taken away. So think critically. There's some other harder ones, like, is there a time when it's okay to take the right of life away from someone? That's a tough one, and maybe for you the answer is never. I'm not here to convince you that capital punishment is justifiable. The right to life, the right to search. Is there a time when it's reasonable for the government to say, yeah, normally we need a warrant, but yeah, you know what, we're just going to search you without one? Because, ... right? What's the ... When is it reasonable for them to detain you or imprison you without a trial? They're just going to hold you, like they did with Maher Arar and Omar Khadr in Guantanamo Bay, because they were connected to terrorism. Now, it turns out one of them actually was engaged in terrorist activity, and the other one just was flagged because of his name was on a no-fly list, and he was tortured in Syria for a year. So, whereas Omar Khadr actually engaged the American troops in a firefight in Afghanistan, but he was underage, so he ended up in Guantanamo Bay. Maher Arar ended up in Syria and was detained and tortured for about a year because he was linked to terrorist organizations that he had no linkage to. It was just unfortunate that he was flying with a certain name, and there's other people with that name that were on a no-fly list. So detention, imprisonment, arrest, search and seizure, life, liberty, these are all good questions. This is some of the toughest questions that you can ponder. When is it okay for the state to say, you know what, you're right, this person doesn't have the right to life? There was a prisoner in Walla Walla, Washington in the early 1990s. He was a criminal arsonist, meaning, and he was like a repeat offender. He had burnt, I want to say like 100 places in the the Spokane area. And he said, you know, if you don't kill me, all I will do is think about escaping. And as an aside, escaping prison in Germany is not a crime because they expect that you want to do that. But in the United States it is. And when I escape, I will burn buildings down. And there had already been casualties. Already people had died because of the buildings that he burned down. So in the state of Walla Walla, Washington, in Washington state, they executed him. I said, okay, well, we're going to kill you then. Is it ever okay to detain people? I think we talked about that one, sorry. Language rights in Canada, we have official right to bilingualism. Is it ever okay for the federal government to say, je ne sais quoi, do not speak French? You know, we're just gonna go English here, right? Are they ever like, you know what, you're at an embassy in Nepal, and you know, our French guy just, he's at home right now with the flu, so if you want to talk to a Canadian, you're talking to us in good old English. Is that justifiable? Is it reasonable for them to limit you and your right to speak to someone in French at a Canadian embassy? Because it's a small embassy and their francophone staff are sick at home because Nepal has a high rate of COVID-19 right now. When is it reasonable for them to say, you know what? Usually we êtes-vous en favor de bilingualism, but right now we don't. Right now we don't favor bilingualism. So my French is really amazing, isn't it? So many good years of learning French right there. So, are there any times when maybe we can say, yes, you're right, you have the right to have an education in French, but we don't have French high school in Wetaskiwin because we don't have enough francophones? Is that a reasonable limit? Or do you think one is enough? If we have one francophone student in grade 10, maybe we should have grade 10 social studies in French. Now, that would probably be online and distance ed then, wouldn't it? So, when is it reasonable to limit people is the topic. And I think I'm going to leave it at that. And let you wrestle with that for probably 20 minutes, which takes us up to 9:35. Then we'll have a short discussion, and then we'll move on to our next topic.